Welcome to City Vision University's podcast, providing book summaries of books on rescue missions, city missions, and the Salvation Army.
So glad to be here.
And welcome to today's deep dive, everyone. We have a genuinely fascinating document on the table today. It's a historical text, a compendium titled Preparing a Home Plymouth City Mission UK.pdf.
It really is an incredible find.
Right. And what this source does is it chronicles the incredibly complex, 150-plus year evolution of the Plymouth City Mission, which, later birthed the Shekinah mission in the UK.
Yeah, it's a remarkable piece of history. I mean, what we have here is not your typical dry institutional history full of, board meeting minutes and budget approvals.
It's really not.
It's a visceral, ground-level account of what urban compassion actually looks like, how it smells, how it operates, and really how it survives across different centuries.
Exactly. And the mission of this deep dive today is to track that evolution from the very beginning. So we are going all the way back to the 1830s.
A very grim time.
Unbelievably grim. We're going to examine how a small group of citizens looked at this impossibly dark, disease-ridden port city and decided they couldn't just, step over the bodies in the street anymore. They had to act.
And more importantly, how that intervention had to adapt over time.
Right, because a philosophy of compassion is one thing, but maintaining it through global wars, shifting economic paradigms, and radical cultural changes, over a century and a half, that requires an almost superhuman level of resilience.
That adaptability is the core theme here. We are going to see their methodology undergo massive shifts. They start by handing out religious tracts on Victorian street corners.
This is literally handing out paper.
Right. And by the end of the text, they're providing specialized medical diets in modern facilities and running complex job training programs. Yet the core impulse, that refusal to look away from human suffering, remains stubbornly intact.
So, for you listening right now, whether you're a professional in the social work sector, maybe a student of urban history, or just someone captivated by raw, unvarnished stories of human resilience, this deep dive is going to challenge you.
It really will.
We're going to look at what it truly takes to, as the source material so bluntly puts it, sit in the gutter and help people.
To understand the sheer scale of what these founders were attempting, we really have to understand the environment they were operating in.
Yeah.
You can't separate the mission from the chaos of its geography.
Let's paint that picture. We are in Plymouth, England, early 19th century. This isn't just any town.
No, it's a massive nautical and military hub.
Yeah, and the document describes the atmosphere with this brilliant, evocative phrase. It calls it a curious blend of rollicking good spirits and great sadness.
That dichotomy defines everything about the city at this time. Because of the prolonged wars with France and Spain, Plymouth was operating at a fever pitch.
Just constant movement.
Exactly. You have a local economy completely inflated by the military-industrial complex of the era. The docks are bustling, taverns are full, wealth is flowing through the merchant class. But it's an economy built entirely on death.
The psychological toll of that must have been suffocating. The text notes that the population was constantly dealing with the arrival of captured enemy ships, but also the devastating news of familiar vessels being lost at sea.
Right, which meant the sudden deaths of intimate friends and family members.
Exactly. The entire city was just vibrating with this collective, unresolved trauma.
And that trauma was compounded by the normalization of extreme violence. This wasn't a city that hid its brutality behind closed doors. The military discipline of the era was theatrical in its cruelty.
The source provides a detail that is just staggering to a modern reader. It notes that it was a common occurrence, literally just another Tuesday in the city, for a soldier to be sentenced to 500 to 1,000 lashes for desertion. Yes, carried out in public, watched by hordes of stupefied spectators on the Hoe, which is this large public park area in Plymouth.
They cite one specific instance where an officer from the Plymouth garrison was given 1,000 lashes in front of a vast crowd of soldiers and civilians.
1,000 lashes? That's a death sentence.
It practically is.
Yeah.
And when a government institutionalizes that level of violence as a public spectacle, it invariably bleeds into the psychology of the civilian population. You become desensitized.
You'd have to be.
Right. If a crowd can watch a man's back be flayed open for desertion, they're going to have a very high tolerance for the suffering of a beggar freezing in an alley. Empathy becomes a very scarce resource.
And the social fabric was tearing in both directions. You had violent lawlessness at the bottom. The text mentions carriers who traded between Plymouth and the dock area literally had to arm themselves with pistols just to make the journey.
Just to go to work.
Yeah, because the streets and alleys were overrun with thugs and highwaymen. And at the exact same time, you had flagrant, brazen corruption at the very top.
Oh, the document is quite pointed about this. The naval officers and leading merchants were deeply involved in embezzlement and smuggling, operating with total impunity.
There's this one detail that perfectly captures the dysfunction. Some of the British warships were so heavily laden down with contraband goods that the officers had smuggled aboard that it was actually deemed dangerous to take those ships into naval action.
They were too heavy with stolen loot to fight the French.
Yes. The ships were too heavy with stolen loot to fight the French. It's absurd.
It's the ultimate systemic failure. The institutions mandated to protect and govern the city are entirely compromised by greed. So you have a traumatized population, a violent public sphere, and a corrupt ruling class.
All of this creates a massive vacuum of care, and that vacuum is most lethally felt in the slums.
Which brings us to the area known as Stonehouse. The living conditions described in this section of the text are, well, the word they use is ghastly, and frankly, even that feels insufficient.
Yeah, we aren't just talking about poverty here. We're talking about a total collapse of public health infrastructure.
The geography of Stonehouse was a nightmare of urban planning. It was this dense conglomeration of narrow alleys and closed-off courts. There were no proper streets or squares to allow for airflow.
And no drainage whatsoever, no ventilation. Houses that were meant for single families were divided and subdivided on every single floor.
You had these dark, rotting staircases with rickety handrails leading up to warrens of human habitation.
And crucially, no running water and no municipal facilities for removing refuse. A contemporary writer from the period is quoted in the text noting that every single room was crammed with people. They were swarming with vermin.
And the most horrifying detail is the complete lack of spatial separation for basic human functions.
Oh, yes.
Tenants were washing their clothes, drying their clothes, cooking, eating, drinking, and sleeping in the exact same unventilated room.
You try to visualize that. The moisture in the air from the drying clothes, the smoke from the cooking fire, the complete lack of sanitation.
The text describes children roaming around almost completely naked, playing in literal pools of stagnant water and sewage that just collected in the courts because there were no drains.
It's an aggressive daily assault on human biology, and the psychological coping mechanisms for this existence were exactly what you would expect. Every third dwelling in the nearby Mauricetown area was an inn or a tavern.
The alcohol dependency wasn't a moral failing. It was a necessary anesthetic.
Yeah.
You had to numb yourself just to exist in that space.
The local government's negligence was so profound that local government board inspectors officially went on record stating that Plymouth and Devonport ranked alongside Warsaw as the most insanitary town in Europe.
Which sets the stage for the inevitable biological consequence of packing traumatized, malnourished people into unventilated, sewage-filled slums.
Cholera.
When cholera struck, it didn't just spread, it detonated. The source notes that twice during the mid-19th century, cholera outbreaks swept through these specific tenements and wiped out nearly 2,000 people in a horrifyingly short span of time.
Nearly 2,000 people.
And cholera is a particularly cruel disease. It causes rapid, severe dehydration, it kills quickly, and it is entirely a disease of contaminated water and poor sanitation.
This is the crucible that forces a response from the citizenry, because the government clearly isn't coming to save them.
Exactly. And this is where we meet Dr. Samuel Derry. He's a local surgeon, a well-known and highly respected figure in Plymouth.
His family's prominent, right?
Very. His nephew, William Derry, later becomes the mayor and builds the famous Derry's Clock near the Theatre Royal. Dr. Derry is on the front lines of this cholera epidemic. He's treating these patients day in and day out, but he's hit a wall of absolute despair.
He's watching his patients die, and he realizes they aren't dying because medicine lacks a cure for the bacterium. They're dying because of their geography. They're dying from their zip code.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah, please.
Think about a modern-day emergency room doctor. Let's say a patient comes into the ER with severe advanced lung cancer. The doctor uses every tool in modern medicine, prescribes the best treatments, administers oxygen, stabilizes the patient.
Right.
But then, at the end of the shift, the doctor is forced to send that patient right back out the door, knowing the patient lives locked inside a sealed, smoke-filled room.
Wow. Okay, yeah. So the medical intervention, no matter how sophisticated, is rendered entirely futile by the environmental reality.
Exactly. The doctor realizes that treating the symptom is pointless if you cannot change the environment causing the disease.
And that is exactly where Dr. Derry finds himself. He sees the stinking sewers, the filthy drinking water, the profound social despair, and he identifies them as the actual engines of the epidemics.
Treating cholera with Victorian medicine was useless if the patient had to go back to a divided room in Stonehouse to drink contaminated water.
This is a massive paradigm shift in the history of public health. Dr. Derry recognizes that you can't isolate physical health from environmental and spiritual well-being.
He hits the ceiling of what clinical medicine can achieve in a vacuum. He knows he needs a holistic intervention. But the problem is, how does one local surgeon launch a holistic intervention against systemic urban squalor in the 1830s?
Well, he doesn't go to the corrupt city council, and he certainly doesn't go to the military brass.
No, he goes to the community.
Specifically, one Sunday, he stands up and shares his agonizing vision with the congregation of the House Street Chapel, which was a Baptist cause near the old Bedford Street. He lays out the raw reality of what is happening just blocks away from their pews.
And that passionate appeal serves as the catalyst. He manages to recruit 18 professional men from the city to carry this vision forward.
They come to a collective realization. The state is absent. The military is predatory. If the poor are going to survive, these citizens have to insert themselves directly into the chaos.
Which brings us to a historic date. September 19th, 1836. This is the official founding of the Plymouth Town Mission.
But these 18 men realize they have the passion, but they don't necessarily have the operational blueprint, so they bring in a heavy hitter.
A Glaswegian man named David Naismith.
Yeah, who is he exactly?
David Naismith is a crucial architect in the history of urban social work. By 1836, he had already been instrumental in forming similar urban missions in London, Dublin, Paris, and even across the Atlantic in New York.
Oh, wow, so he's global.
He was, for all intents and purposes, the foremost global expert on how to structure a grassroots urban charity. The document notes he traveled to Plymouth specifically because he had heard of the wretched social and spiritual conditions prevailing there.
So you have this perfect storm of local passion, professional backing from Derry's committee, and the operational expertise of Naismith. You would think the city of Plymouth would throw them a parade.
You'd think so.
I mean, you're coming in to clean up the slums, educate the poor, and fight cholera. Who could possibly object to that?
The source of the opposition is one of the most fascinating sociological details in the document. The pushback doesn't come from the smugglers who want the alleys kept dark.
Right.
It doesn't come from the tavern owners who want the poor kept drunk. It comes from the other local churches.
It's unbelievable. The text explicitly states that this eminently worthwhile venture was dogged by dissent because established local chapels actually rallied together to try and strangle the mission in its crib.
It's a profound irony, but honestly a very common historical pattern. The text points out that these opposing churches had themselves done precious little to relieve the misery rotting right outside their stained glass windows.
They had adopted what the document calls a laissez-faire attitude. They were perfectly content to let the status quo remain.
And we have to understand the theology of that laissez-faire attitude. In the Victorian era, there was a deeply ingrained, almost institutional belief among the middle and upper classes that extreme poverty was a moral failing.
Like it was their own fault.
Exactly. It was seen as a divine judgment on laziness or vice. Therefore, to heavily intervene, to go down into the slums and offer unconditional help, was viewed by some as almost subverting the natural ordained order of society.
So when Dr. Derry and David Naismith start organizing this energetic grassroots movement that is actually going to wade into the raw sewage of Stonehouse to help these people, it acts as a massive, glaring mirror to the established churches.
Precisely. It highlights their complacency. Institutions often fear grassroots movements because the movement's very existence is an indictment of the institution's failure to act.
They felt deeply threatened that this unseemly young fledgling, as they called it, would disrupt their comfortable social standing.
The bureaucracy of their opposition is almost comical. The Pastoral Aid Society, an organization literally named for providing pastoral aid, formally expressed to Derry's committee a deep fear of overlap.
Overlap. They were worried about accidentally helping a destitute family twice.
It perfectly encapsulates how institutionalized charity can lose the plot. They become more concerned with territorial control, preserving their donor base, and maintaining bureaucratic boundaries than they are with the actual human beings dying of cholera.
Fortunately, David Naismith was completely unfazed. He had built these missions in major cities all over the world. He had seen this exact ecclesiastical turf war play out everywhere he went.
He writes this incredible stabilizing letter to Dr. Derry. The language he uses is so pragmatic. He tells Derry, "I have no fear. The Lord will make all things turn out for good."
And his core advice is essentially just ignore the noise. He writes, "Hear it if you will and must, but hear it as if you heard it not."
He tells Derry to keep his eyes on the actual mission, plucking sinners as brands from the burning. He advises the committee not to waste a single breath or drop of ink making speeches against the dissident churches.
He insists that the town mission and the Pastoral Aid Society can exist in the same city without quarreling, even if the other side wants a fight. His abiding motto for the Plymouth mission becomes, "All things shall be done by us in love."
But Naismith and Derry knew that a motto wasn't enough to protect them from the political sabotage of these rival churches. They needed an operational firewall.
Right. If the mission was going to survive in this highly polarized sectarian environment, their agents on the street had to be absolutely unimpeachable.
Which leads to the formulation of their bylaws. They met at Dr. Derry's house and drafted a set of rules for their field agents that is incredibly intense.
Yeah, I'm reading this document, and it honestly reads like a strict corporate compliance manual from the 1830s.
They recognize that one misstep by a street agent, one controversial theological argument with a local vicar, one political debate in a tavern could be seized upon by their opponents to shut the entire operation down.
Let's go through some of these rules because they paint a picture of exactly how disciplined this compassion had to be. First, agents had to give themselves wholly to the work. They were mandated to spend 5 to 6 hours every single day strictly visiting from house to house in the slums and holding meetings.
And that is exhausting, grueling labor in those conditions. But the behavioral constraints were even tighter. Rule 9 is the core of their survival strategy.
What does that one say?
It explicitly forbids agents from entering into any unnecessary controversy upon religious subjects. It states, "Do not interfere with the peculiar tenets of any individual respecting church government. To cautiously avoid all topics of an irritating tendency."
And Rule 10 goes even further. To studiously avoid entering upon subjects of a political nature as foreign as the purpose of your visit.
They were there to help, not to debate the Corn Laws or the monarchy. They were even forbidden from circulating a single tract or pamphlet that hadn't been explicitly pre-approved by the managers.
The vetting process to even become an agent was an absolute gauntlet. The document includes the questions to candidates, and it's a deep psychological probe. They aren't just checking your theological orthodoxy. They want to know the absolute core of your character.
They sent questionnaires to the applicants' references, asking things like, "What is your opinion of his temper and prudence? Is he mild, humble, courteous in disposition, or is he forwarding and assuming?"
They wanted to know if the candidate had seriously weighed the crushing difficulties they would face. They specifically asked if the candidate was prepared to handle the ignorance and prejudices of the very people they were sacrificing everything to help.
Right, because the people they're helping aren't always going to be grateful.
Hold on, let's pause here. Because reading these strict bylaws, the intense interrogations, the banning of unapproved literature, the tone policing, doesn't all of that seem fundamentally at odds with the concept of radical grassroots compassion?
It's a fair point.
I mean, we're talking about going into the gutter to love the unlovable, but they're operating under a deeply rigid, top-down corporate structure. How do those two things coexist without crushing the spirit of the work?
It's the central paradox of organized intervention, and it's a brilliant question. To our modern ears, it sounds stifling, but we have to view it through the lens of 1836.
Okay.
That rigidity wasn't designed to stifle the compassion of the agents. It was engineered to protect the delivery mechanism of that compassion.
A delivery mechanism that was under active attack from the local establishment.
Exactly. In a highly sectarian environment, strict neutrality was the only armor that worked. Naismith and Derry understood that the moment an agent introduces political debate or sectarian theology into the relief work, two terrible things happen.
What's the first?
First, you give your political enemies the ammunition they need to cut off your funding and run you out of town. Second, and more importantly, you create a massive barrier between the agent and the vulnerable person they are trying to reach.
Oh, I see. If you walk into a starting family's room and start debating the nuances of Baptist versus Anglican church governance, you've completely lost the plot.
The rules were a forced mechanism to ensure the agents led with empathy and practical presence, rather than ego or debate. The strictness was a firewall to keep the focus laser-locked on the walking wounded.
So with this incredibly strict operational manual in place, they hire their first agent. His name is Thomas Gaff, brought in from the London City Mission. And his salary for this grueling, dangerous work, a mere £65 a year.
Which, even when you adjust for historical inflation, was practically a poverty wage itself. The document subtly highlights the inherent class disconnect here.
Yeah, a bit of hypocrisy.
A bit, yes. This meager salary was dictated by a board of professional men, doctors, and retired army officers who were living in comparative luxury in Plymouth's secluded, affluent suburbs.
The classic disconnect between the boardroom and the boots on the ground. David Naismith actually seemed to recognize this dynamic. He wrote a warning to the committee about Goff, basically telling them to manage their expectations.
He said, "Do not expect him to be perfect. Keep him in his own place that he be not spoiled."
So they deploy Goff into the hardest areas of the city. New Street, Castle Street, Lambay Hill. These were the epicenters of poverty and disease.
And the political tightrope walk they had to perform was absurd. In the early days, the document notes they had to meticulously restrict where they held their street meetings, specifically so they wouldn't accidentally upset the local clergymen who were actively opposing them.
Think about the cognitive dissonance of that. You have an agent willing to walk into a slum infected with typhus, risking his own life to bring comfort to a dying family. And he has to constantly check his map to make sure he isn't standing too close to the parish lines of a vicar who hates him.
It's madness. But despite the grueling conditions, the meager pay, and the ecclesiastical sabotage, the strategy worked.
People responded.
They did. The sheer consistency of their presence resonated with the marginalized. By 1839, just 3 years after they launched, they had outgrown their initial spaces.
They had to move their public meetings to much larger premises at the Mechanics Institute in Princess Square because the crowds of the working poor seeking their help had grown so large.
We've talked a lot about the overarching strategy and the board's rules, but what did this work actually look like, practically, day-to-day on the street?
Yes, the document provides us with something incredibly precious here. The preserved journal entries of the early missioners from the mid-19th century. This gives us the visceral, ground-level reality.
These journals are the heartbeat of the document. They strip away the romanticism of charity work and show you the grinding, complex, and often dangerous micro-interactions that make up an agent's day.
Let's focus on one specific missioner, a woman named Sarah Venn who was operating in the 1850s. Her accounts are breathtakingly raw and deeply human.
Her entries perfectly illustrate the emotional whiplash of the work. You're entering people's private, highly stressed spaces uninvited. The spectrum of reactions is immense.
She writes about this one afternoon. She notes, "In Queen Street, the tracts were refused, but just around the corner, they were received gladly."
That immediate pivot from rejection to open arms in the span of 50 feet.
And she is encountering the full, diverse tapestry of Victorian urban life. It wasn't just a monolith of poverty. There were distinct subcultures.
Oh, absolutely. She records going to one large multi-tenant house, and the residents flatly refuse to let her in, telling her they have absolutely no time for reading her tracts because they are theater people. They just shut her down.
And then later, she knocks on a door and encounters a man making corks. She offers him a tract, and he doesn't just say no, he gets physical. He literally pushes her backwards out of his doorway and aggressively tells her he has no interest.
It really highlights the physical vulnerability of the missioners, especially female agents like Sarah Venn. You are stepping into the territory of people who are exhausted, marginalized, and highly defensive.
Offering them a piece of religious literature when they are struggling to survive can easily be perceived as an insult.
But then we get this incredibly cinematic, complex encounter in Octagon Street. Sarah is holding an open-air meeting. There are about 200 people gathered around listening to her.
And a group of women, the journal refers to them with the Victorian euphemism, fallen women, likely sex workers, start aggressively heckling her. They're berating her, shouting her down, actively trying to disrupt the meeting.
Which is a completely understandable sociological reaction. If you're a marginalized woman surviving in the illicit economy of a port city, and an outsider representing middle-class moral authority steps into your street and starts preaching, your immediate instinct is territorial defense. You're going to attack the intruder to protect your space.
Exactly. But here's the twist that makes this story so profound. Sarah Venn doesn't have to defend herself. Two of these heckling women's own friends, women from the same community, living the same life, suddenly turn on the hecklers.
They shout, "Shame! shame, and physically step in to pull the disruptors away so Sarah can continue.
That detail is magnificent. It shatters the stereotype that the poor were just a hostile, unthinking mob. It reveals the complex social hierarchies and moral codes within the slums.
Even among those society had cast out, there was a faction that recognized Sarah Venn's genuine intent. They recognized that she was showing up for them when the rest of the city had abandoned them, and they demanded she be treated with a baseline of respect.
And Sarah's work wasn't just street preaching either. She was walking into the epicenter of the city's biological nightmares. She writes about visiting a woman in King Street who is suffering from full-blown typhus fever.
Sarah is standing in this infectious room, noting quietly in her journal, food was brought in and medicine left to cool her.
She routinely visited 4 different wards in the local hospital just to sit, read, and pray with the dying.
And this is where we really see the mission acting as a proxy for the missing welfare state. Her interventions are deeply practical. She writes another entry that is easily overlooked, but historically massive.
Which one?
She writes, "The young lady in Flora Place has learned the letters of the alphabet and is now to teach her husband."
Wow. That one sentence is a revolution.
It absolutely is. The mission isn't just handing out Bibles. They are providing the fundamental mechanics of literacy required to read them. By teaching a working-class woman how to read and empowering her to become the educator of her own husband, Sarah Venn is completely upending the gender and class dynamics of the era.
This is structural empowerment masquerading as a pastoral visit.
It's brilliant. And they are encountering the broader geopolitical trauma of the 19th century, too. Plymouth is a port city, so the whole world washes up on its shores.
Sarah notes meeting a black man at a gathering in King Street. He stood up and told the crowd the story of his escape from slavery. These agents are absorbing the grief of the entire globe.
There is another account in the document from an anonymous agent that highlights different kind of advocacy. This agent visits the local workhouse and meets a man described as a pauper lunatic.
Society had basically thrown this man away, locked him up to forget about him.
But this man begs the mission agent to advocate for his liberation from confinement.
Think about the trust that requires. When you are the only person who consistently shows up to listen, you become the repository for all of their unaddressed needs. These missioners were functioning as hospital advocates, legal proxies, and social workers decades before those professions formally existed.
And the emotional weight of being that sole repository of hope is almost unfathomable.
That weight is perfectly captured in another story from that same anonymous agent. He is visiting a profoundly ignorant, deeply impoverished man who is on his deathbed.
The dying man can barely speak or express himself clearly. His friends are gathered around the bed and they keep telling the agent, "Don't bother, he is unconscious, he can't hear you."
But the agent leans in and simply mentions the name of Jesus, and this dying man, who everyone thought was totally unresponsive, suddenly stretches out his hand, grasps the agent, and whispers, "That is all my trust. He's all I want now."
It is a staggering reduction of faith to its absolute irreducible core, stripped of all theology, all debate, just a desperate grasp for comfort at the very end of life.
But let's take a step back and think about the sheer psychological toll this must have taken on the agents themselves. In our modern workplace, we talk constantly about caregiver burnout, compassion fatigue, the necessity of mental health days.
Right, and these Victorian missioners were doing this 5 to 6 hours a day, 6 days a week.
They are immersing themselves in typhus wards, workhouses, and the raw grief of cholera in an era before antibiotics and before any concept of psychological support.
It requires a level of conviction that is frankly difficult for a secular modern mind to fully grasp. They were sustained by a theology that viewed their daily grind as a literal cosmic battle for eternal souls.
But human psychology has its limits. The document briefly alludes to the fact that agents sometimes had to be cautioned or were let go.
When you read between the lines, you have to wonder how much of that failure was actually just the psychological fracturing of a human being crushed by the sheer volume of trauma they were witnessing.
It is an incredible, heavy foundation. For decades, this model localized door-to-door visitation, distributing tracts, street corner preaching was the engine that sustained the mission.
It was a model of penetration,
Yeah.
walking into the courts and alleys. But as the 19th century bleeds into the 20th century, the world fundamentally breaks, and the mission is forced to drastically evolve its tactics just to survive.
If we look at the macro-level shift here, the 19th century model assumed that poverty was localized and often tied to individual moral choices.
But the 20th century introduces mechanized global trauma on a scale that shatters that assumption. You can no longer treat the symptoms with just a pamphlet.
Let's talk about the cataclysm of the First World War. The source notes that the mission's resources were stretched to the absolute breaking point. The nature of the city changed.
It wasn't just local sailors anymore. It was massive military mobilization.
You have mission staff going to the various military barracks in Plymouth, giving evangelistic addresses and handing out Bibles to thousands of young troops right before they board the ships to head to the slaughter of the trenches in France or Belgium.
For many of those boys, that missioner handing them a Bible was their final point of spiritual or pastoral contact before they died.
And the ripple effect of that mechanized carnage hits the streets of Plymouth incredibly hard. The text points out a heartbreaking shift in the language of the missioners' reports during this era. Suddenly, you see the widespread appearance of the term one-parent families,
which represents a massive sociological shift. Prior to this, single motherhood was heavily stigmatized, often hidden or categorized differently. But the war created a generation of widows and the results of transient wartime romances.
The demographic of need changed overnight.
It did. You had a sudden influx of grieving mothers trying to keep their children alive without a breadwinner in a shattered economy.
A tract on temperance doesn't feed a war widow's child.
Exactly. As the need becomes exponentially more complex, moving from basic sanitation to profound grief and systemic economic devastation, the missioners themselves have to mutate. They can't just be itinerant preachers anymore.
They have to become comprehensive social workers, navigating the early beginnings of the modern welfare state.
Which brings us to a character in this history that I find absolutely fascinating. Alice Foley.
Yes. She steps onto the scene in 1939, right at the precipice of the Second World War. The document paints a brilliant, vivid portrait of her.
It calls her a great name in the mission's history.
She is described as having a gentle face, but a very firm chin, with eyes that glinted kindly through rimless pince-nez glasses.
Alice Foley is the avatar for the mission's mid-century evolution. She represents the professionalization of compassion.
The text makes it clear she wasn't just a visitor reading scriptures. She worked incessantly across multiple disciplines.
She was acting as a marriage guidance counselor, a nurse, a welfare visitor, a therapist, and a social worker, all simultaneously.
She is an entire modern nonprofit organization rolled into one person with a firm chin and rimless glasses.
She had to be. The problems of the interwar and WWII years were deeply systemic. You needed someone with her incredible diligence to advocate for families through the bureaucracy of rationing, housing, and government welfare, while still providing the deep pastoral care that was the mission's DNA.
Her perseverance through the Plymouth Blitz, when the city was being absolutely leveled by the Luftwaffe, is legendary. She operates through the bombing, the rubble, and the slow, grinding post-war reconstruction.
But the years following WWII bring their own massive challenges. The mission enters a very lean period. Attendance drops. Funds dry up.
It isn't until the late 1950s and 60s that we see the next massive evolution in their strategy, driven by a man named Edgar Trout.
Edgar Trout is the one who revitalizes the Old Bath Street mission. And his methodology is a fascinating pivot. It is highly proactive, but unlike the 19th century model, it is geographically stationary.
Right. Instead of walking miles all over the city every day knocking on doors, Trout instigates these late-night Saturday evangelistic meetings at their building.
The source uses a great fishing metaphor. They were literally fishing people off the notorious Union Street and drawing them into the warmth and welcome of the small mission hall.
And it worked. The hall would be crammed to absolute capacity.
This is the paradigm shift I was referring to earlier. For over 100 years, the operational model was centrifugal. The energy went outward from the mission into the streets, into the homes, dispersing across the city.
But under Edgar Trout, the model becomes centripetal. The energy draws inward. You establish a safe haven, a warm, bright, welcoming physical space, and you pull people in out of the darkness.
You create a sanctuary. You give them a reason to leave the alley.
Precisely. You offer a stark physical contrast to the cold, the rain, and the danger of Union Street. You provide a cup of tea, physical warmth, and safety.
And securing that physical anchoring in the Bath Street premises is historically vital for what happens next. Because that concept of the safe haven, that specific geographical footprint, eventually evolves into the city's official night shelter.
Which sets the stage perfectly for the mission's most radical, modern, and frankly miraculous transformation. We are going to fast forward a few decades to the year 1992.
The old night shelter at Bath Street is closing down.
The city council has built a new hostel called Ship Single Homeless in Plymouth, and they're moving operations there. So the old Bath Street building is sitting there totally empty, abandoned, and to be honest, disgusting.
Enter Viz and Peter Chapman. and a small, fiercely dedicated group of local Christians who call themselves the Isaiah 58 Prayer Group.
The account of this transition in the document is astonishing. They include Viv Chapman's personal recollections, and she does not sugarcoat it.
No, she doesn't.
She notes that she'd been praying since 1985 specifically to work with homeless people. Her husband, Peter, had actually been employed at the night shelter. The Isaiah 58 group feels this strong collective pull to open a Christian day center.
But they have a major problem. They have no building, no funding, and no real resources. They have a vision, but no infrastructure.
Then a visiting church minister from London comes to speak to them, and he issues a very direct challenge. He essentially asks them if they are spiritually blind. The old night shelter building is sitting right there, empty, so they arrange with the council to go visit it.
Viv describes walking into this abandoned building just before the homeless folks were allowed in for the evening to sleep, and it is in a dreadful, horrifyingly run-down state.
She is walking through, looking at the pitiful, meager belongings of the people who rely on this space, and she specifically notes a smell that passed description. The stench of unwashed bodies, despair, and neglect is overpowering.
She is breathing this in, and she has this moment of profound doubt. She asks the Lord, "Are you sure? Is this really where you want us to be?"
It's the ultimate collision between the romanticized ideal of charity work and the brutal, olfactory reality of severe poverty. It is one thing to pray for the homeless in a clean church. It is another to stand in a room that smells of urine and despair and commit your life to it.
But in that very moment, surrounded by the stench, she says she suddenly knew it was exactly right. It was an absolute conviction.
By the time the rest of the prayer group arrived to tour the building, she writes that she was on fire. She was showing them around this dilapidated, smelly ruin as if she were giving them a tour of Buckingham Palace.
They managed to secure the use of the building. Now they need a name. They gather to pray and discuss it, and two members of the group simultaneously suggest the exact same word, Shekinah.
Shekinah is a deeply powerful, ancient biblical concept.
Yes, it refers to the historical moment when King Solomon dedicated the newly built temple to the Lord and the Shekinah glory of God. The literal, manifest, blinding presence of the divine fell upon the building.
To take a derelict shelter that smells beyond description, a place society has abandoned, and name it after the majestic, radiant glory of God that tells you absolutely everything you need to know about the Chapman's philosophy.
It is an act of profound theological defiance. By naming it Shekinah, they are declaring to the city that this space, despite its physical degradation and the brokenness of the people inside it, is sacred ground.
So they open the doors of the Shekinah mission, and reading about their early operational days, it feels so chaotic and breathless.
Very much so.
Think about a makeshift field hospital set up right behind enemy lines during a war. They have no official supply lines, no bureaucracy to fall back on, no guaranteed reinforcements.
They are operating purely on adrenaline, instinct, and a refusal to surrender the territory. They are triaging human suffering day by day, relying on whatever provisions they can scavenge or pray for.
The anecdotes of how they survived those early days are extraordinary. It is a daily exercise in trusting the impossible.
They are completely unexplainable.
Take this one story from their early lunches. They have 25 hungry adults show up at the center for a meal. But the workers check the pantry, and all they have to offer is a pile of vegetables. No protein.
Peter Chapman, who clearly has a very intense, direct relationship with his faith, steps out of the kitchen and literally shouts at the sky. He says, "Lord, you promised us meat for these people and that you would supply all our needs."
He is treating the divine promise as a binding contract and demanding immediate fulfillment.
And he gets it. Seconds after he shouts this, the phone in the center rings. Peter picks it up, and it's a voice at the other end saying, "I have 8 quarters of turkey that have been defrosted. Can you use them today?"
Peter doesn't miss a beat. He says, "We are having turkey for dinner."
It is highly specific, instantaneous provision. And the document makes clear this wasn't an isolated incident. There's another story involving their cook, a man named Elliot Pierce.
Elliot comes to Peter in a panic because he only has 4 pounds of mince on hand. Mathematically, 4 pounds of mince cannot feed 25 adult men.
Right, 4 pounds of mince is maybe enough to make a decent shepherd's pie for a family of 6. But Peter, operating with that frontline field hospital faith, tells Elliot not to panic.
He tells him to just pray over the food as usual and start serving the portions anyway.
And a little while later, Elliot comes running out of the kitchen, absolutely astounded, exclaiming that all 25 people received a hearty portion of mince. Mince that, according to the laws of physics and inventory, simply was not there.
What these stories illustrate, beyond the miraculous, is the environment of total, terrifying reliance the Shekinah team was operating within. When you have no safety net, no massive endowment, and no guaranteed municipal funding, every single meal you serve is an exercise in profound trust.
But supplying a miraculous turkey and multiplying mince is only part of the equation. Offering a warm, uncritical welcome is beautiful, but we have to ask the harder question.
Right. How does a warm welcome and a hot meal actually change the deeply entrenched, complex traumas of the people who walk through those doors? Because as we know today, chronic homelessness isn't just a lack of calories.
No. It is almost always a complex, tangled web of severe addiction, untreated mental illness, and generational trauma.
This brings us to a crucial philosophical argument presented in the document, one that directly challenges how we evaluate charity today. The source explicitly argues that counting heads relying purely on immediate quantifiable metrics is a fundamentally flawed way to judge this specific line of work.
Right. If you are an auditor looking for a quick, measurable ROI, a return on investment on your compassion, you are going to be deeply disappointed by Shekinah.
Because the tangible results of this kind of deep relational intervention rarely happen on a quarterly schedule. They often take years, sometimes decades, to fully manifest.
You are planting seeds in concrete, essentially. You water it, but you may not be around to see the crack in the pavement when the green shoot finally pushes through. The document provides several incredible multi-decade case studies to prove this exact point.
Let's trace some of these long-term ripples, because they are deeply moving. First, there's the story of a young man they refer to as the Yub. He was a teenage troublemaker, chaotic, aggressive.
He caused so much mayhem and disruption at Shekinah that, despite their ethos of uncritical welcome, they actually had to ask him to leave the premises on multiple occasions. He was just too volatile.
Eventually, he vanishes entirely. 3 years go by. They assume he is in prison, or worse. Then, one Friday night, the Shekinah team arrives to open up, and there he is, standing quietly, sedately at the entrance, waiting for them.
The text says he was the exact same guy physically, but his demeanor was entirely changed. Somewhere in the dark over those 3 years, the unconditional grace he initially abused and rejected finally took root in his psyche.
Then there is the story of the London executive. This is a fascinating psychological profile. Here was a man who was particularly adept at foul language and verbal abuse.
He would come to the mission, sit on the front steps wearing dark glasses, and just let rip, verbally abusing the workers as they went in and out. He was a wall of hostility. And then, like the Yob, he just disappears.
Years pass. Then, one day, Peter Chapman is closing up the building after a horrendous, exhausting day. There is a knock at the door. Peter opens it, and standing there is a man in a very nice, sharply tailored suit.
Peter has no idea who he is.
The man introduces himself and explains that he is the angry guy who used to curse at them from the steps. He tells Peter that he eventually moved to London to get away, but he couldn't escape the memory of Shekinah.
The Bible studies he had overheard, the spiritual truths, the sheer fact that they didn't retaliate when he abused them, it embedded itself in his mind. It bothered him for years until he finally walked into a church in London, gave his life to Christ, got clean, and completely rebuilt his life.
His character change was so profound that his barrister actually used his conversion as evidence to get him a conditional discharge for an old theft charge. He bought a train ticket and traveled all the way back to Plymouth for no other reason than to knock on the door and say thank you.
It is the ultimate repudiation of short-term metrics. The mission in Plymouth absorbed his abuse and planted the seed. A totally unrelated church in London watered it years later, and the man's life was saved. You cannot capture that trajectory on a spreadsheet.
You really can't. And if we look at the timeline, the ripples go back even further. Look at the story of Donald Swanson. The document includes a letter he wrote from Liverpool.
He recounts his very first visit to the old Bath Street mission. It was way back in 1946. He was just a young sailor in training, wandering down the notorious Union Street.
An elderly woman stops him on the corner, hands him a tract, and kindly invites him inside. He goes in, and the speaker that night is a man named Jimmy Welsh, who was an ex-naval commander. That night, Donald is converted.
And the generational impact of that single night in 1946 is staggering to quantify. Swanson writes in his letter that he went on to marry. He had 2 sons and 2 daughters, all of whom became committed Christians.
And as of the time he wrote the letter, 2 of his 10 grandchildren had also made professions of faith. Dozens of lives, spanning nearly a century, all tracing their spiritual lineage back to one elderly lady standing on a cold corner and an ex-commander sharing his faith.
I love the specific details the document provides about Jimmy Walsh, too. It notes that he was part of the inner caucus of prayer warriors at the mission. He was a very quiet, self-effacing man, which is surprising given his distinguished, authoritative naval career.
But the detail that people vividly remembered about him decades later was the loud squeak of his well-polished boots whenever he got down on his knees to pray. It's those quirky sensory incidentals that anchor these massive historical moments in absolute relatable humanity.
It grounds the narrative. It reminds us that institutional history is actually just a collection of real, flawed people with squeaky boots, rimless glasses, and heavy personal burdens.
Speaking of personal burdens, one of the most beautiful aspects of the Shekinah story is how the staff themselves often brought their own histories of deep trauma into the work. They weren't aloof saviors, they were wounded healers.
Take Peter Salkeld. He was a highly educated professional journalist who moved to Plymouth to manage a section of the Evening Herald newspaper. But beneath his professional exterior, he was carrying a heavy sack of worries and personal disasters.
His internal life completely collapsed, and he was driven to attempt to take his own life. He survived, but ended up admitted to the psychiatric wards of Moorhaven Hospital.
But he found a pathway back to sanity. A friend brought him to a local church. He experienced a profound spiritual breakthrough, and he eventually became one of the most zealous, dedicated workers at Shekinah.
He was uniquely equipped to help the clients because he had literally survived the utter darkness of psychiatric collapse. He could look an actively suicidal client in the eye with total earned empathy.
And you see that same earned empathy in Wendy Chapman, the deputy manager at Shekinah. The text affectionately calls her a Barbican girl to her fingertips, bringing an incredible zest and bonhomie to the heavy atmosphere of the show.
She is quoted in the document saying, "Think of my life. I had seen it, done it, kicked it, and got the t-shirt. Given my own difficult and deprived background, I know how many of our clients feel, where they are hurting."
That kind of lived experience is the most valuable currency in social work. You cannot synthesize or train that level of authenticity. When a client who has spent the night sleeping rough looks at Wendy, they don't see an administrator holding a clipboard. They see a survivor.
They see someone who has navigated the exact same treacherous waters they are currently drowning in. Wait, I need to jump in here and bring this back to the reality of how charity works today. Because hearing these stories of the Yob or the London executive brings up a massive friction point.
I think I know where you're going with this.
We live in a world where nonprofits and charities are almost entirely beholden to incredibly strict funding boards, government grants, and municipal oversight. To keep the lights on today, you need hard metrics. You need key performance indicators. You have to prove to a board that X amount of grant dollars resulted in Y amount of successfully rehabilitated individuals within a 12-month fiscal cycle. How on earth does a mission like Shekinah survive in the modern era when its historical foundational ethos is, as the text quotes, to simply cast our bread upon the waters and leave the results entirely to God?
You have zeroed in on the defining existential crisis of modern faith-based charities. How do you quantify grace? How do you put a KPI on unconditional love?
It seems impossible.
You have this fundamental grinding clash between the necessary bureaucracy of modern funding, which rightfully demands measurable outcomes to prevent fraud and ensure taxpayer money is used efficiently, and the theological, psychological reality of human transformation, which is agonizingly slow, often invisible, and highly nonlinear.
Because if a government auditor evaluates Shekinah based solely on their interactions with the Yob during his first 3 chaotic years, the mission looks like a spectacular failure. The ROI isn't just zero, it's negative, because he is actively draining resources and causing property damage. A strict grant committee would pull their funding immediately.
Exactly. But if you evaluate that exact same case study 10 years later, the ROI is historically immeasurable. He is a transformed citizen. So the survival strategy for modern missions like Shekinah is that they have to become fiercely bilingual.
Bilingual.
Yes. On the ground floor, face-to-face with the clients, they have to fluently speak the language of absolute faith, infinite patience, and unconditional love. But when they walk upstairs to the administrative offices, they have to fluently speak the language of metrics, subsidiary statuses, pilot program deliverables, and statistical analysis to the local health authorities and grant committees.
They have to translate the miraculous into the measurable.
Which perfectly explains the final systemic evolution of the mission's journey that the document outlines in its closing sections. How do they take this uncritical, deeply relational love and marry it to professional systemic solutions for the 21st century?
It begins with a very sober, clear-eyed assessment by Peter Chapman. Reflecting on the future trajectory of the mission, he acknowledges a grim modern reality. He notes that it still seems as if no amount of wealth or prosperity will protect the vulnerable and weak.
We live in an era of unprecedented global wealth compared to the 1830s, yet the core, intractable brokenness of society remains entirely unchanged.
Chapman actually points out the great tragic irony of their profession. He states that the absolute greatest measure of Shekinah's success would be to eliminate the very societal needs that they serve. The goal is to put themselves out of business.
But he admits that this is a utopian dream. The demand for their help will remain. Therefore, the mission cannot just rely on multiplying mints and waiting for miracles. It must evolve its infrastructure to attack the root causes of poverty, not just the symptoms.
This is where we see the final, mature 21st century iteration of Dr. Samuel Airy's original 1836 vision. The organization strategically pivots. They attain subsidiary charity status within the broader Plymouth City Mission framework.
They appoint a formal board of directors to apply direct professional focus to their operations.
They realize that handing out a bowl of soup keeps a person alive for another day, but it doesn't change their trajectory. The new overarching goal of the modern mission is to expand heavily into comprehensive training and rehabilitation services.
Chapman explicitly outlines their philosophy. They want to lead clients away from dependency, whether that is economic dependency on the state or chemical dependency on addiction, and guide them towards rebuilt self-esteem and a truly independent lifestyle.
They are targeting the systemic engines of poverty. And we see this philosophy perfectly executed in the specific modern initiatives the document highlights at the end. The prime example is the HEAL Project.
Yes, the HEAL Project is a fascinating intersection of modern medicine and historical compassion. It was a program actually funded by the local health authority, operated out of the Shekinah Drop-In Center.
The goal was to provide highly specialized, tailored medical diets for their clients. They were cooking specific meals for people actively recovering from drug and alcohol abuse, for pregnant women living on the streets, for severe diabetics, and for clients dealing with gross obesity and dangerously high cholesterol.
Stop and think about the historical trajectory represented in that one project. In the 1850s, Sarah Venn was standing in a squalid, unventilated room in King Street, simply leaving a bottle of rudimentary medicine to cool next to a woman dying of typhus, hoping for the best. Fast forward to the modern era, and the exact same mission is officially partnering with the government health authority to provide targeted biochemical nutritional therapy to stabilizing the neurochemistry of recovering heroin addicts. The scientific methodology is light years ahead, but the underlying impulse, the recognition that you cannot preach to a body that is biologically collapsing, is identical to Dr. Derry's original revelation.
And tying back to our discussion about metrics, they proved it worked. The statistics meticulously prepared during the HEAL project demonstrated clear, measurable, positive changes in the client's health during the record-keeping period.
They successfully learned to speak that metric-driven bureaucratic language to secure the grant funding without sacrificing an ounce of the unconditional love that defines the drop-in center.
Another brilliant example of this mature, multi-layered methodology is the Shekinah Mission Charity Shop located on Union Street. On the surface, it seems simple, but it is actually a highly sophisticated piece of social engineering.
It isn't just a retail space to raise operational funds, although it successfully does that.
Right. It serves a multitude of overlapping community purposes. First, it offers desperately needed, deeply discounted children's clothes to the struggling families in the surrounding neighborhood.
But crucially, the shop provides an active training ground. It creates an opportunity for volunteers and recovering clients to get actual resume-building work experience in a structured retail setting.
It is real-world job training disguised as a thrift store. And perhaps most importantly, it acts as a low-barrier, non-threatening outreach point.
That is the genius of it. Walking up to the main doors of a homeless shelter or a mission can be incredibly intimidating for someone who's just starting to slip into crisis. But walking into a charity shop to browse for a coat is normalized behavior.
The shop provides a soft entry point where vulnerable people can just drop in for a chat with the staff behind the counter. It meets the marginalized exactly where they are without the stigma of asking for formal help.
It is a brilliantly holistic ecosystem. Under one roof, you are generating revenue, providing cheap clothing to poor families, offering job training to recovering addicts, and maintaining a soft entry triage point for pastoral care.
So, synthesizing this entire sweeping 150-year journey, We started with a single, deeply frustrated surgeon in the 1830s, angry about cholera, stinking sewers, and government apathy, sending a few guys out with pre-approved tracts for £65 a year.
And we end with a multifaceted, highly sophisticated nonprofit organization providing medical dietary therapy, complex job training, overnight accommodation, and deep psychological counseling.
A century and a half of evolution, from localized Victorian first aid to modern systemic rehabilitation, all held together by a single, unbroken thread of uncritical, radical compassion. It is truly an incredible legacy and a testament to what a small group of determined citizens can build.
It really is.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the history of the Plymouth City Mission and the remarkable workers at Shekinah. There's immense practical value in studying this kind of historical compassion. It doesn't just inform us about the past, it directly challenges our modern empathy. It forces us to look out our own windows and ask what we are ignoring in our own cities, in our own time.
And as we close, I wanted to leave you with one final thought to ponder. If the ultimate stated goal of a rescue mission is to cure poverty, to completely eliminate the very societal needs that justify its existence, how do we reconcile that noble goal with the grim historical reality that human brokenness seems to be a permanent fixture of civilization? Perhaps the true lasting legacy of these 150 years isn't just about the utopian dream of curing all poverty. Perhaps it is about the profound, unyielding power of simply choosing not to look away. What happens to a city when even just a handful of people refuse to let the vulnerable be forgotten?
A deeply challenging question to end on. Keep questioning, keep learning, and take care of each other out there. Goodbye.